Okay, I'm going to start recording, and then Myrna, when you see the chat, then I'll hand it over to you.
Good afternoon. Welcome, bienvenidos. I am Mirna Perez, and I am the Director of the Voting Rights and Elections Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. For those of you that don't know us, the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with NYU School of Law, and I'm super excited today to be moderator of this discussion. As I think you know, the program is being produced in partnership with the Knight Foundation. The Knight Foundation champions the role that journalism and the arts play in maintaining a healthy democracy. They commissioned a comprehensive study called The Untold Story of American Non-Voters, which was the impetus of this discussion. A special thanks to Sam Gill for his contributions to the program. We are also very grateful to our long-term partner, New York University's John Bradema Center, which is dedicated to civil debates on politics, public policy, and other major issues facing our world. The Knight Foundation study, The Untold Story of American Non-Voters, revealed a very disturbing statistic. In 2016, 43% of eligible voters, that's nearly 100 million people, did not cast a vote for president. The Brennan Center for Justice is at the center of the fight to protect every voter. And I'm a voting rights lawyer, so I'm someone who loves voting, and I think the right to vote is the most important of our fundamental rights. So the idea that an American would not exercise their right to vote frustrates me to no end. So in our time together, we're going to try and answer 3 questions. Who are these eligible voters? Why don't they vote? And what can we do about it? I am super grateful to a terrific panel of folks who will help us explore these and other questions about the political and policy implications of so many Americans not voting. We have a goal for this conversation, and that is to inspire audience members to think about things we can all do to engage these non-participating Americans to use their voice at this critical time in our democracy. So let me introduce our guests. The first we have is Trey Grayson, former Secretary of State from the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Hi, Trey.
Hey, Myrna. How are you? Greetings from the Bluegrass State.
Thanks for joining us. We then have Yvette Alexander, who's the Director of Learning and Impact at the Knight Foundation. Thanks so much, Yvette.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here.
And finally, we have Abby Kisa. She's Director of the Impact at the Tufts University Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. Hi, Abby.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having us here.
Well, welcome to you all, and thank you so much for your work. Before jumping in, I do want to invite those listening in our audience to share your questions for the panel. You can type them into the Q&A box, and we'll take as many as we can during the program. So, Yvette, I'm going to start with you. The report was fascinating and terrifying. Can you tell the audience about what y'all found?
Sure, absolutely. So, Knight Foundation noticed that a lot of our polling as a country focuses on these likely voters, right? So we want to know about what people think about politics and how they're engaging with issues that are likely to show up to the polls. But we really don't know a lot about, as you mentioned, the nearly 100 million people who didn't vote in 2016, or those that frequently don't vote and remain disengaged from our democratic system. So that caught our attention and was the reason why we launched this study. So we surveyed over 12,000 of these non-voters to understand, how they're feeling about about elections, about our political system right now, and key platforms and issues. We also surveyed a subgroup of very active voters and a subgroup of young emerging voters who are eligible, who are 18 to 24-year-olds. So it provides some really interesting color and comparison when you look at the attitudes and behaviors of these groups versus the non-voters. So of course, the non-voting population at the size of it is not a monolithic group. So when you ask, who are these people, they're, a very diverse cross-section of American society. There are, certainly they span all socioeconomic strata. All educational groups have non-voting folks among them. And however, they do, skew slightly younger. They do skew, less college educated and lower income. Those were very correlated with not voting. And that's some of these demographics are known. What was new from the study was a look at how they view our election system and certain engagements, that behaviors that they do or don't exhibit when it comes to politics. So the first finding I want to point out is that many non-voters suffer from a lack of faith in our election system, and they have serious doubts about the impact of their vote. And to be fair, some voters have doubts about the impact of our vote as well. But we saw that really jump for non-voters. So 38% of non-voters were not confident, for example, that elections represent the will of the people. That's 38% that fundamentally don't think the election system works. And that's in a normal election year, perhaps not even one affected by the pandemic as this election coming up might be. Also, non-voters were less likely to believe that votes are counted fully and accurately, and they really didn't connect the dots for them on how decisions are made in Washington and the impact of their personal life. So to them, it didn't matter too much who was in power. Not much about their personal life seemed to change. Another thing that stood out to us from the data, and this was true across demographic groups, was that non-voters engage less with news and they're left feeling underinformed when it comes to politics, candidates, and issues. So, for example, non-voters were twice as likely as active voters to say they passively encountered news versus actively seeking it out, and to say that they don't feel they have enough information about candidates and issues to decide how to vote. Personally, I think that a lot of the news that we encounter assumes some baseline understanding of politics and issues and candidates and what's going on. And it's kind of hard for someone to just get pieces of it every now and then, or maybe scroll through headlines on social media and be left feeling informed. Also, their media tends to involve more entertainment as compared to active voters. And that's certainly true, the younger the person is. So we'll probably be seeing more of that in the future. Another interesting thing that perhaps goes against conventional wisdom is that a lot of these chronic non-voters were more evenly divided on key issues and on support, for example, for President Trump than maybe was previously thought. So I think what we took away there was that there's not one party that stands to gain overwhelmingly from everyone participating. That has a nice benefit across political ideologies. Finally, we did look at the emerging electorate, as I mentioned, and we found that when you compared an 18 to 24-year-old to a non-voter or to an active voter, they looked more like a non-voter than non-voters themselves. So they were less likely to be interested in politics, even than non-voters, less likely to report following political news. A lot of them even decrease their news consumption in an election year, for example. And they felt less informed than non-voters when it came election time. They also struggled the most with the voting process, finding that kind of difficult to navigate. So those were kind of broad brush points that we found. And I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, so thank you so much. Thank you for that table setting. I'm sure that news is very interesting to our audience. I'm going to go to you, Trey, next. So when you were the Secretary of State of Kentucky, you were actually one responsible for administering elections and engaging voters. And to get that job, you had to run for office. So you had to appeal to voters. So I think you're uniquely qualified to answer my next group of questions. As was just mentioned, one of the many interesting things about the report was the evidence that non-participating Americans self-identify as Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and the rates were all within 5 points of each other. So we see Americans of all political stripes not participating. I want to know from your perspective, what do you think that election administrators can do to get more people registered to vote and voting? And what about the political parties? What role do they play?
So let me start with the second part of that question first. To me, this is one of the most important findings, you can't stereotype the ideology or the partisan breakdown of people who don't vote. My hope is that going forward, we can disseminate this fact more broadly, because I don't think this is very well known or very well believed in our rhetoric, our dialogue about how to make elections work better. There seems to be an assumption that both political parties have, which is more voters means better for the Democrats or better for the progressives or on the left of center. And similarly on the right, that there's a fear, I think, among Republicans and others that if there's more voters that they would do poorly. And then the thing about, and this I think goes back to your perspective about how running for office and then also running elections. At the end of the day, policymakers, most of them are elected. They want to be reelected. They think they deserve to be reelected. And so when you ask them to make changes that might reduce the odds of them being reelected, obviously they're going to err a little bit on the side of not passing a law, so their side doesn't win, or, they themselves don't win. So, I mean, that's not the way you'd like them to make policy, but that's just natural. And so one, just communicating this out, and then we can step back and say, okay, what are the laws we need in this country so that people can vote, more often, securely, accurately, those sorts of things, and less on it's going to favor one side or the other. So I think that's pretty important. Now, specifically, what can election administrators do? Nellie Gorbea, who's currently the Secretary of State of Rhode Island, she and I wrote an op-ed a couple weeks ago that was in The Hill. If you Google it, I'm sure you can find it online. We were both worked with Knight as consultants on the study to help them ask the right questions and crunch the data and things like that. And it was a real honor for both of us to be part of that, to give that election administrator perspective. So our op-ed kind of goes into more detail, but we identified a couple of things. So one is election administrators need to help with the education process and how elections work. Yvette cited several different statistics, several different points in the data, younger voters not understanding how the process works, younger non-voters, all non-voters not trusting in the system, thinking it's rigged. The irony is that a lot of our election administration is fairly transparent. Now, election administrators don't necessarily rush to share that transparency. They don't necessarily welcome that scrutiny and those observations. They don't communicate it very well. I think it's probably on us to step forward, us meaning election administrators, to show how the system works, to show the machines, to show how the counts work, to explain that process. I also think that this is yet another bit of evidence for long-term civic education. Now, that's not a short-term solution, but it is. This data screams from more civics education, and from how your vote matters to how government works to how the election process works, and lifelong civic education, not just K to 12. I also would wish the election administrators would sometimes, it's fine in the system, there is partisanship. In Kentucky, we try to make it transparent. You run for office, our county boards of elections have Republicans and Democrats. Our state board is governor, Republicans and Democrats. They're appointed by the political parties. We put that partisanship right out front and said, this is how we're going to do it. Both sides are going to be in the room so we can watch one another so that voters can trust. But that education process, putting that partisanship aside, being transparent, civics education, those are some things we could do. I think advocating for registration reform to make it easier to update through online, to programs like ERIC, which allow us to identify people who've moved into the state, and maybe we can reach out to them to register to vote, to share data across state lines. online, automatic or automated voter registration, so that when people interact with government, they can see that their data gets updated. Those are some of the tools that election administrators ought to advocate for. In some cases, they can even implement them without law change. They're already authorized. They ought to go do it. So those are a few of the things that I think we ought to look at.
And I know that much of our audience come from states, and they have been asking, how is it that we can make our state process more inclusive and bring more voters in? And Secretary Grayson just offered you some really good food for thought there. So Abby, I want to go to you next. Part of the work at the Circle Center at Tufts is to understand what is going on with the youth vote. The report explained that youth participation rates were pretty disappointing. Do you have a theory as to why that is? What do you think is going on there?
Thanks so much, Myrna, and thank you to the Brennan Center and Knight Foundation for hosting this conversation and working on the report. So glad our director was a part of it. So first, I want to point out that the issues and the emerging electorate have actually been around for decades, and they're not unique to Gen Z, who is sort of the youngest eligible voters right now. And I also just want to amplify that we saw huge increases in youth voter turnout in the 2018 election. And that was, in our analysis, because of youth leadership, and especially young women of color. So I want to nuance the conversation a little bit, because some young people do vote, and those young people have shown that they can affect election outcomes on both sides of the aisle. But to answer your question, Myrna, taking a wider view, the collision of events that are happening right now really makes me worry about how equitable and representative the 2020 youth electorate will be, and what it will mean for some young people's participation in the future. We already have many issues of inequitable access and information among young people, and that has led to decades-long differences in which youth participate. There will be 15 million young people who have turned 18 since the 2016 election, and I'm a little bit worried about it. And there's several elements to the report that I think reiterate that understanding an emerging electorate is understanding that voting is an activity that we learn, and that there are messages that young folks get even before they reach 18 that can make them more or less likely to vote. Where to find information about voting, that was addressed in the report. Whether or not your voice matters, who's listening to you, feeling like your lives are affected by the election. We as a society have control over these areas, including policy, which has an effect on youth voting, which I know we'll get to that at some point. So because these decisions about whether or not to vote don't happen in a vacuum, excuse me, we really have to be thinking about this. So this is why we've been talking about an idea called growing voters, because we can't wait until young people reach 18 for them to get positive messages that their voice matters, and that their voice matters regardless of their zip code, which we see too often. So this is why having a conversation about solutions in this 2020 moment is really important. And this process of supporting an emerging electorate is something that all of the stakeholders and more that we've discussed today can do. All of these civic institutions can have some effect on. For 2020, all of this is more important and more challenging. Unfortunately, we've left small d democratic participation up to partisan campaigns and philanthropic funding for too long. And the most negatively affected and left out are young people from marginalized communities, layering on the marginalization even more. So for example, when we're looking at a year in 2020, when we're talking about expanded vote by mail, we know that there are big gaps among youth on knowledge and use of this method of voting. In the 2012 and 2016 elections, we saw dramatic differences in which youth used vote by mail, and Black youth and youth of color from low-income communities were least likely to use it. In a participatory research project that we did with Opportunity Youth United, we found that youth from low-income communities, many Black and brown communities, were not aware of online voter registration. So part of what we need to understand is that non-voting among youth doesn't happen in a vacuum. And that this report shows elements of how our de facto systems to promote democratic participation are unequal. So we've started to talk about what we can do. The 100 Million report talks a lot about information access and finds that youth are most likely to struggle with the voting process, as has been pointed out. So this is a great time for local media to be thinking about whether and how they're reaching the youngest eligible voters with actionable information. And as Trey has pointed out, it's a great time for K-12 educators to be talking about the many elections that are happening this year, local and national, since we know local issues can really engage youth. And of course, you know, communicating with schools as a nonpartisan institution has a great reach to a large diversity of young people and indirectly their families. And so one other element that the 100 Million report touches on that I think is relevant this year is this idea of outreach and recruitment, because that is always critical to an emerging electorate, not only to understand that their voice matters and someone is reaching out to them because of that, but also with basic information. This is how people learn about an election and how they become part of a network that supports them and can often, for young people, turn into what we like to call political homes. And so this can promote young people feeling like they belong, that they can be useful, take on leadership positions and heard, which are critically important. But these political homes need support in this moment, and we need to figure out how to do that in some ways digitally. So that's one thing that I think is actionable, support these local youth organizations. But also, it's a really great moment for election administrators to be thinking about how young people can take leadership as poll workers. And many states already allow for 16 and 17-year-olds to do that too, which is really exciting. So there's a lot that we can do in 16 months, and it really needs to start now.
Yeah, so Abby, you were saying things that were just music to my ears. I think so many people don't realize the way that public education and intentionality about how we bring people into the electorate can really matter. And at the Brennan Center, we are in the business of trying to make sure that more people are able to participate in the vote. And we do this in a bunch of different ways, some of them by championing reforms that bring more people into the process, like automatic voter registration, like election day registration. We also try to do things that involve eliminating barriers to the ballot box, like felony disenfranchisement laws. And we also fight back against voter suppression. But this is a question for all of you. One of the predominant reasons we heard for people not voting is because they have a lack of faith in the electoral process. Given the coronavirus crisis, this concern of legitimacy may be more widespread, and it may be harbored by even regular voters. What are some things that we can do about the moment we are in now to try and restore people's faith in this? Why don't I start with you first, Abby? Mix up the order.
Yeah, well, you know, something that Trey said about really local election administrators kind of, showing people being in a community and showing people what was really happening with an election to show that things are being done in a fair way are things that I think is a real opportunity specifically for young people, right? And we're working with the city of Minneapolis to study their amazing, diverse program to allow young people to be poll workers. And these are some of the things that I think, over time can build more faith. If you know an election administrator, someone who worked as a poll worker, right? And so that's one really clear example, and I think a real opportunity in this particular year for many states who allow young people to work as poll workers to kind of open this up and see how things are done.
Okay, so why don't we go with you, Trey? What are the kinds of things we can do right now to increase legitimacy and confidence in the outcome of the elections?
Well, first I'll echo the poll worker comment, in part also, or because we always struggle with poll worker recruitment, but in the middle of a pandemic where one of the most vulnerable populations are senior citizens, that's the population that usually serves as poll workers. So we're seeing, if you ask any election administrator this year, one of their top worries is how could I run an election day where there's voting in person, whether it's on election day itself or whether it's part of an early day or early voting, several weeks before the election process. And so there's this real opportunity to solve sort of two problems, the critical election administration need of poll workers and this longer term problem of bringing youth into the system. I also think it's important to highlight when there are really good actions to try to do something. So I want to highlight Kentucky. I want to brag about my Democratic governor and my Republican Secretary of State. Kentucky passed a law when I was secretary to allow the election to be postponed in case of an emergency. It wasn't clear whether you could change the manner of voting in the case of an emergency. And in a pandemic, we need to change the manner of voting. For states that don't allow expanded vote by mail options, you have to do it at least right now. You know, maybe you don't want to make that, maybe you don't like that as a permanent solution, that's fine. But in a pandemic, we need to have those vote by mail options. So our governor and Secretary of State used a law that was clarified by the legislature, controlled by Republicans, to do this. And so I just think it's great. I try to tell this story across the country. We have a Republican and Democrat came together. They were in the middle of, they actually fought about a couple of other things during the session, but they came together. And so for our primary, and I actually sent my absentee ballot in yesterday to cast my vote for next month's primary, they came together, and that's just a great symbol that we ought to communicate and show folks, look, they set their partisanship aside. The Republican secretary says, like, look, I got beat up by some people on my side who don't understand why we need to do this, but I did it anyway because it was the right thing to do. And there are folks on the front that the governor would say, you know, why are you trying to, you know, why did you give in on this particular point to the Republicans? Like, it was important for us to be together. So showing that side by side, we're going to work through the pandemic, that's really important. You know, I worry about all the high schools that plan to register voters and communicate the importance of voting in the spring of the senior year. And that opportunity was probably missed out. Certainly couldn't have been done in person. The registration process was a real challenge. And so schools that are starting up in the fall, which will more likely have some level of in-person activity compared to the spring, we got to make sure that that is part of this. Because campaigns are only going to focus on the people who are likely to vote. You know, again, going back to wearing my former candidate hat, we have limited resources. So our volunteers, our dollars for marketing, we're going to focus on those who are likely to vote. We're not going to focus on these 100 million. And so that's where administrators, the public, the media, and everybody else needs to step up to focus on that broader population. But it's now more than ever with this pandemic, it's really challenging, and we got to highlight those good examples.
Okay, and we're going to go to you, Yvette, next. But for those of you just tuning in right now, the question on the table is, what can we do in this current crisis to give people confidence in the outcome of an elections and to make them feel like the process is worth them spending their time to be participating in?
Sure. Well, I think first of all, it's a really big question and one that's going to need to be attacked from multiple angles and multiple groups that participate in that. So I would point to echo a little bit of what's been said. I think that we need to step into the shoes a bit of non-voters or hard to reach voters, perhaps they vote occasionally, to really understand, you know, what their struggles are, what's driving disengagement. I think, you know, this report, but then the others out there to help, you know, reveal some of those underlying aspects can be helpful not only to reach non-voters, but now perhaps to even reach voters who might share some of these concerns that previously it was mostly non-voters who shared. So, you know, just pointing to a few things. Obviously, we have the finding on the legitimacy of elections, potentially very challenged this year. And I would echo what, you know, Trey had touched on before, which would be having bipartisan cooperation, perhaps to help, you know, show support for the legitimacy of whatever is decided in terms of the manner of elections this year and any changes that are made. Having kind of both sides of the aisle stand behind our election system and our democracy would be really helpful, I think, to support the legitimacy of the election. Another thing I wanted to point to, and this goes back to some comments Abby was making on the relationship between information and engagement. You know, at Knight Foundation, we believe that relationship exists and is, you know, very strong in democratic societies, that, you know, citizens need to be informed in order to take action that's in their own best interest. And so, you know, I think we see issues not only with non-voters, but with many voters and youth voters on the information piece. So I think, you know, as we're thinking about the 2020 election, how do we, if there are changes, if there are things that need to get communicated or changes made, what are the messages that need to reach voters, and how do we give that information out in ways that's segmented to many different types of voters, not one size fits all, right? You communicate differently to a 25-year-old than you would to a 70-year-old, and we want both to be at the polls. You know, we believe that obviously democracy is strongest when we have, you know, both both broad and deep participation of its society. So those are some things that I would point to. And I also want to highlight an opportunity, though, I think in the midst of the challenges for 2020, is that, we saw that non-voters or hard to reach voters often doubt in the impact of their vote. Perhaps, with the challenges facing the country right now with coronavirus, having things like, the press briefings from the White House, people have perhaps been a little bit more paying attention to news and to decisions being made by elected officials. So perhaps it's a good year to illustrate the impact of those decisions and of one's own vote for 2020.
Okay, so before we turn to the audience questions, I want to riff a little bit on something that Trey just mentioned, which is that in this current crisis, there should be bipartisan support, and there sometimes is bipartisan support for two important pillars of making sure the elections go off well. One is access to vote by mail options, and the second is safe and sanitary polling places for folks that are not going to take advantage of vote by mail opportunities. But it hasn't always been the case that the politicians are in line with the experts and the voters are on this. So I'd like for each of you guys to reflect on what can we and the audience do to try and help our election administrators, how to support them when the voters are aligned, the experts are online, the election administrators are on the line, but the politicians seem to be the ones doing the fighting. So I'll start with you, Trey.
Start with a former politician, right? So it is a challenge, and I think that one, I go back to, I cite this Knight Foundation study whenever I talk to people about, look, the non-voters, they're not favoring one side or another. So I try to make a long-term point about that. But stepping up to volunteer, identifying the poll workers, doing your part, requesting, helping to communicate the rules, because one of the real challenges is right now in states like Kentucky, but all of my neighboring states are having to broaden their vote by mail rules. Ohio it just went through its primary and had to do it. The rules are changing and helping to communicate. So we, a lot of people do get their information from social media. We can bemoan that. That's another conversation for another day, but it's the reality. And so we as individuals, the folks on this webinar, our friends, our neighbors they trust us. That's one of the things that studies have shown is people trust their friends. Maybe they shouldn't, but they do with information. And so let's share the information. So when a rule changes on how to get an absentee ballot or where to go vote, a lot of places are consolidating polling places so they can have that safe spot where you can have social distancing. And because they know there'll be fewer people in person voting in that jurisdiction, they can do this consolidation. And so there's a number of reasons why they may do it, but helping to communicate that out, we have to share that information. And so that's something I and some other folks we've been trying to do in Kentucky is we've changed this rules where now anybody can get an absentee ballot. In the next day or so, we're going to have an online portal. Let's make sure we share that out because the governor is going to talk about it in his daily briefing, which, as Yvette said, is these governor's daily briefings are getting extraordinary audience views from people who don't pay close attention. And so, those who watch those who just care about this, we need to share all that out and get it out in the place where people get their news, which isn't the 6 o'clock news on a local TV station or a local radio station or a newspaper anymore. Again, we can bemoan that. That's just the reality. But getting out where people are and disseminating that's like an empowering thing that we should be able to do and make sure it's factual. Like these are the rules, this is how you can do it. Click here for more information. The Secretary of State's Association started an effort called Trusted Info, which is a hashtag marketing effort, but it's also trust your government officials. They are the ones that are going to communicate the rules accurately. So that's another place to encourage people to go to those government sites, get that information on voting, and share it out as best we can because there's going to be a lot of new voters and a lot of new rules, and that could be a recipe for disaster.
Okay, Yvette, what can we do to help our election administrators get the word out in this highly politicized time?
For the everyman among us, for myself, I think it's helpful for us all to be very thoughtful about the messages that we're sending, as Trey pointed out, to our social media networks, to our friends and family. I think, while it's healthy to be, critical where the country needs to improve, and, what doesn't work for people, we need to be thoughtful as Americans that, some of the things that we push on social media, what's the source, being very conscious about, identifying misinformation or disinformation, and is what I'm posting going to discourage somebody from participating at all? How do we if we see something that needs to be better, how do we call for that, but while also encouraging people to exercise their basic democratic rights? So I hope that coming into this election that people are conscious that what they say on social media does have an effect and can turn people off or on to the idea of participating in democracy.
Thanks, Yvette. And then Abby, what can we do to help our election administrators in this highly politicized time?
Yeah, well, in addition to young people as poll workers, I'm gonna, go back to young people's leadership again, because one of the things that we actually did over the past couple of years is support some local groups with our partner Opportunity Youth United to partner with election administrators to help an election office reach more young people who haven't voted yet. And we really found that young people taking on a partnership with local election administrators can help broaden an election administrator's network and communicate with young people who they were not going to reach otherwise, and give them advice on how to reach those young people. So I think that this idea of, Minneapolis is using youth ambassadors for their primary this summer. This idea of young people as leadership, as young people as assets to a community, to an election, not only, as Trey said earlier, can help an election, reach a lot more people, but also gets young people into the thinking that they matter to a community.
Great. Okay, so we're going to turn to audience questions. So thank you to everyone that has submitted something into the chat, and thank you for those that pre-submitted. One question that keeps coming up, and it's an issue that weighs very, very heavy on my heart and was raised by people like Bonnie and Leroy and Maura. How are we going to reach voters when the digital divide is real? And not everybody has the same access to technology, like email, like the internet. I know that there are people in my church that don't know how to use Zoom and are not comfortable communicating via email. And in-person engagement is so important to turning people out. How do we shift and make sure that there are those voters that are not left behind? Can I start with you, Trey?
Yeah, gee, thanks. Give me the easy question first, right? It's you're right. The digital divide is real. I have a college-age student and a high school-age student, and we're upper middle-class family. We have great internet connection. Our kids did fine. They were not all their classmates fell into that category. They lost a semester of learning. Parents had to stay home because they couldn't take. There's just a whole lot of challenges that we have right now. So the digital divide is real. Younger voters, fortunately, use their phones a lot, and so they maybe have less of a digital divide in some respects with the ability to tap into a smartphone. But that's short messaging. So I think a couple things. One, old-fashioned mail can be helpful. One of the things that the Kentucky decided to do to spend its dollars that were in the CARES Act to help fund elections was to send a postcard to every registered voter in Kentucky, letting them know about the new rules for absentee voting. That's old school. Now,
yeah, I'm sure some of your members are like, "What, mail?
Yeah.
Like, with a stamp?" Yeah.
No, it's interesting. I would happen to be outside the other day when the mail came, and I was struck by the number of houses the postman skipped because they didn't get any mail that day. And it's like, I always remember as a kid, like every mail, the full mailbox and all that. But some old technologies like mail. But it is a challenge because we can't do door to door right now. I was talking to some campaigns. There was a candidate for state senate. He says, "How do I go door to? I can't go door to door. I'll offend people. I'll lose votes if I go door to door. What can I go do?" And so his idea was he was just going to have a flyer that he would just drop with a little note. "Here's my mobile number. Call me." So maybe efforts like that, where we could do some outreach in person, but it's, there's some social distancing there. That could be something that we could do to try to address some of the folks who don't have that technology, especially in more, more densely populated areas where that's a more efficient activity. But some of that old school stuff we just have to do. And then you mentioned churches. That may be another place where some churches feel very uncomfortable with politics. Some really embrace it. But I think if we could just get more churches and places like that to disseminate just the basics, not who they should vote for, but how to vote. That's another place, because churches are trying to figure this out and how to communicate with their congregants. And so that could be another place, and think about those kinds of institutions that are having similar challenges. How are they going to communicate? Maybe we can enlist them to communicate. There's also some, old school stuff. I did a circle study a couple of years ago that after the 2012 election. And one of the things that we discovered was that if there was a conversation, if the young voter, if the young American remembered having a conversation at home with parents about a current event, that they were more likely to vote. And so maybe, somehow we could do an effort, we could enlist employers to encourage to go home and talk with the election about their kids. These are things that are easier to do in presidential elections, but those kinds of interactions where we could have those interactions at home with parents or guardians or whomever, grandparents with kids, that could be another effort where we could try to reach beyond that digital divide. But it's definitely a challenge.
Right. And I mean, even now, even with some reforms like automatic voter registration, that doesn't work if the social service agencies or the DMV is closed to register people to vote.
Yeah, absolutely right.
And especially problematic in states that don't have online registration opportunities. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Troy. Abby, do you think that the youth can be part of the solution? I was talking to an advocate the other day that said, my elderly Spanish-speaking constituencies don't use tech, but their granddaughters do. And so can you talk to us about how that might be a way? Can we have like an adopt a person in your family day and teach them and help them register to vote? What are some ideas do you have that we can use youth leadership for this?
Absolutely. And I think this conversation just, reiterates the point that when we talk about non-voters, we're really talking about access issues and not apathy issues. At least when it comes to young people, that's the case, and all the research that we've done. And, this point about relationships is really critical. Trey talking about family. And that's one of the reasons why young people are so key to all of this, because young people, if you focus on young people, you'll reach their family. Right. And we also know that in many immigrant communities, young people can be a way to reach other people and be a translator for people in their family. So I really think that trusted relationships are a way to negotiate this situation, both young people reaching out to peers, to family, and remembering that this is all about, interacting with people who you care about and who you think their voice matters, right? And so young people can take a huge lead in all of that, both, in tech-enabled things and otherwise, right? We still have phones. We still can use phones in addition to, going way back and using mail. And all of these things are tools that young people have figured out how to use in lots of issue advocacy campaigns. And we need to enlist young people even more in what we're doing, both in terms of election administrators, community organizations, because young people want to be working on things and that they're just looking for concrete opportunities.
Okay, and so Yvette, your study was about some of the reasons why people didn't participate, and some of it was related to information and the way things have been framed. Does the digital divide help or hurt us trying to reclaim some of those voters and get them participating?
Really good question. I think first of all, I think the digital divide can cut both ways. You could be trapped on one side or the other of the digital divide. So, while vote by mail or registering remotely by mail in advance might work for some parts of the population, there are other growing segments of the U.S. where, requiring somebody to go get a stamp seems really like they don't know where to start. Where does one get a stamp? And so it's putting a lot of steps in front of people who may not have really strong motivation to participate anyways. And so, you know, I think the more we can reduce the amount of steps that people have to go through to try to participate this year would be helpful. I also wonder about remote registration. So I know there's a lot of states where you can do same-day registrations. Like I'm 20 years old. I can decide on a whim to show up at the polls and register right there. And so, you know, how do we make that sort of accessible to folks in perhaps if they're not comfortable going in person? You know, and so I come from the state of Florida, so we're a state that has unfortunate headlines for elections mishaps. So I think, you know, in terms of what's shared, you know, the negative things do tend to get highlighted, you know, the hanging chads and the lost ballots. And, you know, this is what people hear and what echoes in their collective memory. And, you know, for somebody who's not raised with the messages that their voice matters, their participation matters, their power matters in society, and that cuts across a lot of groups. I think that we should consider, you know, those messages as well. And how do we, you know, how do elected officials, you know, local and national, try to segment their messages, not just for the one size fits all, or the voter that's most likely to come out, that's most likely to resonate with like particular party platforms, but also the non-voters that were identified in the Knight Foundation study that have a blend of concerns. You know, they might be concerned about immigration, but they also don't want to repeal the Affordable Care Act. They're not fitting into these partisan boxes as well. And so, and that's very true for young people as well. And so how can both elected officials, but people who care about democracy, craft messages with value propositions for those people to participate, even if they're hearing a lot about issues that they're not as concerned with?
Okay, so Paula and a couple of others have mentioned this concern about how all these claims of fraud are making it really hard to encourage people to have faith in the system. And I'm sure in your various different spheres of influence, you come across this claim. And obviously, the Brennan Center has done a ton of research showing that fraud perpetrated by voters is extraordinarily rare. It's certainly not systemic or systematic, but yet it still seems to be something that people go to push back against reform. What can we do about the role that fraud plays in depressing people's interest or confidence in the system? Do you want to go to that, Yvette?
I'm going to probably defer to Abby and Trey on this as well. But, you know, Knight Foundation does fund a lot of research on the role of information and technology on democracy. So we're very interested in, you know, funding the study of how information and misinformation gets spread and its impact on elections as well as other things. And so, you know, I would just say call that, you know, that needs to be more understood and, you know, and probably better addressed, because the more folks become aware of misinformation and disinformation regarding elections, the more it delegitimizes the process. And so we have to think about how to strengthen that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a needle that needs to be threaded, right? Like explaining people what is not true is also may encourage some people to think that this is not really something they want to be participating in. Abby, have you guys figured out a way to thread the needle? Do you have some thoughts on this?
Well, one of the things that this screams to me is a great discussion amongst high school students, right? And, you know, one of the things that's coming up in the Q&A a whole bunch is this idea of civic education and what's happened to civics classes. And not only do we know from research that conversations about current issues is a best practice, but we also know that developing research skills is something that is required across discipline areas. And so this topic would be ripe for conversation in a classroom and for young people to research themselves. You know, one of the best practices that we've been working on is action civics, right? Young people working on issues that they care about to research them and develop solutions. And so, you know, to me, this would be a great thing to talk about with young people, to have young people do a little bit of research on it that they could, and to sift through what's true and what's not, and learn a little bit of skills in the process, including media literacy skills.
Okay, Trey, what do you think?
it's a challenge, especially because both political parties use, in some respects, I call it weaponizing election administration. Not so much advocating policy, but sowing a doubt to encourage somebody to go vote. Like, don't go show them that your vote. Don't let them steal your vote. Don't let them do this. They're going to try to cheat if we do that. And it's kind of a base motivational tool, and it's frustrating. I think I'm a Republican. I'm still a Republican. But my party, I think, does this a little bit more than Democrats. But Democrats do the same thing. They poison the air to try to appeal to their base and raise questions about outcomes in elections as well. And we've seen that in Georgia, for example, where there were clearly some problems with that election, but we also saw a 50,000 vote margin of victory. And so that frustrates me when parties are using this to motivate base to try to vote. But it's a real challenge. It's also been a challenge in this vote by mail environment, where one of the most prominent, again, there's not a lot of fraud in vote by mail, but it sometimes happens. And we had it happen very recently in a high profile race with ballot harvesting in North Carolina. And so if you're not used to lots of people voting by mail, you have this vague memory of, oh, there was some cheating going on in North Carolina. And so I was on a webinar last week in Tennessee, and I was explaining how vote by mail actually works in states where they do this in large numbers, and they don't usually allow ballot harvesting. They also allow ballots to be brought in and taken to a secure location, so you don't have to, because some people worry about the mail, because sometimes mail gets lost. That they have a secure ballot box. Well, some people hear, oh, somebody's just going to steal that ballot box. It's just, it's a big target. Steal me and steal these votes and keep them from being cast. And so there are best practices that administrators, it kind of goes back to the very beginning, where let's be transparent about how this process works. Let's use the facts. I love Abby's comment about let's use young leaders to try to communicate this, and let's try to defeat the party's efforts on both sides to try to motivate their bases by saying the other side's going to cheat. Let's show them. Don't let them deny your vote. Don't let them do this, that, or the other. When the data shows, as you indicated, it sure, stuff happens, but in very small numbers. And the concerns people have are much greater than they really should.
Thank you, Trey. So this discussion has been primarily about how we leave nobody behind in the crisis of the coronavirus. And we've discussed how to get young people more engaged. We've discussed about folks who may be low income. We've discussed the way that people of color may be on the wrong side of the digital divide. What about voters with disabilities? Trey, can you, in your experience as an election administrator, give advice to the audience about what are things that voters with disabilities might be needing right now in order to make sure that they can equally participate and cast an independent and autonomous ballot?
Sure. Well, one of the not unbridled success, but in general success stories in the last 2 decades in elections has been helping to make our elections more accessible to all voters, including those who may happen to have a disability. When I was secretary, we were rolling out the accessible machine so blind voters could vote without assistance for the first time. And I remember getting calls on election day and after election day with one voter was crying about how he'd never had a chance to just go and cast a vote in secret by himself where he could trust the outcome. And the challenge of, when you move away from an election day experience with an accessible machine, those voters are put in a really tough spot. So that's why we always, when we're talking about voting in a pandemic, in most states that haven't already made the decision on how to vote by mail completely, you want to keep those election day opportunities available. And we need to make sure that we, whether it's a scheduled appointment or line spacing or allowing those kinds of tools, we can't let those voters be left behind. Same with language, folks who are not, English language as their primary, that they speak English as their primary language. In a lot of parts of the country, we have to have ballots available in multiple languages. And so there's a lot of challenges as election administration. And we made a commitment in the Help America Vote Act in 2002, nearly 20 years ago, that one of the things we were going to do in America was allow people to vote without assistance, just like we've done that by making curb cuts more accessible and buildings more accessible and changing doorknobs and things like that. We can't lose sight of that in the middle of this pandemic, and we can't lose sight of it once we get back to, once we get through this and we get back to voting however we're going to vote post-pandemic.
Right. So I want to apologize to the audience. We've had hundreds of questions come in today and pre-submitted. Just to make sure that we stay on time, I'm going to ask one last question. I'm sorry that not everybody was able to get their questions presented, but if we could all in very quick lightning form say, what would be the one piece of advice you would give the audience in order to make voting appear to be a nonpartisan issue, but rather an issue of important democratic United States principles. Why don't I start with you, Yvette?
Sure. I mean, I think the good messaging kind of comes back to like the founding principle of democracy, like how it works, why it's important that everyone participates, why your voice matters, and, you know, illustrating how people have used their votes for change on both sides of the political spectrum, I think can be helpful to understand that, you know, this isn't about voting, isn't just about promoting me and my group, but we're all lifted when we can participate together and have people on from different perspectives weigh in.
Great, thanks. What about you, Abby? What is your thoughts?
You know, one of the things that we are talking about a lot this year is media, and including youth-created media. And part of the reason why youth-created media is so powerful is because stories are powerful. And so like Yvette was talking about, I think stories of people who have voted, maybe who haven't voted before and had a transformative experience and why they voted could be really, really powerful in showing people that it's not, you know, other people over there who are participating and whose voice matters. It's you, it's your family, it's your neighborhood.
Great, and what about you, Trey?
So I endorse those two. And I would just say this, that we need to step up. So whether that's being a poll worker or being that source of knowledge for your circle of friends, your community, to share the rules, to register people, to make sure that they are know where to go vote, play that role. And I would say we need people to do that, not in a context of a campaign or a political party or a movement, just as part of our democracy with a small d. We need more people to do that.
Love it, love it, love it. So before we conclude, I know that Yvette Alexander from the Knight Foundation wanted to share some information that they had about upcoming programming.
Sure, and I just want to thank the Brennan Center also for creating this space to talk about both the short game and the long game of, you know, voter participation and how to improve it. So our quick announcement is that if you are curious about the pandemic's impact on voting this year, this Thursday, May 21st at 1 p.m., Knight is launching Election Disrupted. It's a 4-episode deep dive into issues surrounding the 2020 election. It's going to be on our weekly webinar show, Vision. We'll be joined by Nate personally this week, a Stanford law professor and campaign expert who will explore how the current crisis could shape the next national election and what we can do to prepare. Vision is a weekly show about the trends, ideas, and disruptions changing the face of our democracy. It's hosted by Sam Gill, our Knight Foundation's Chief Program Officer. You can RSVP at kf.org/vision, where you can also view our prior series, Flattening the Infodemic. So we hope to see you there.
Thanks so much. And thank you so much to our guests, Trey Grayson, Yvette Alexander, and Abby Keeson. This has been exciting and interesting. I really appreciate the work that you do and the thoughtful efforts you put into protecting our democracy and the right to vote. We also want to note again that we're very grateful for the partnership of the Knight Foundation for commissioning this study on Americans who are not voting. And if you haven't looked at it, you really do need to check it out. It's chock full of really useful information. Thank you to the NYU Bradamus Center for collaborating on this program. Once again, I am Mirna Perez. I am director of the Brennan Center's Voting Rights and Election Program. And we just have a few notes for you on how you can bolster our democracy before we leave. If you haven't already, please go complete your census form. You can find it online at my2020census.gov. It is quick and it is a really efficient way to get the census done, and you can do this despite having to shelter at home. Tell everyone you know to make sure that they get counted in 2020. You can also call your senator and tell them that they have to support the HEROES Act because it includes crucial funding for election administrators to run elections during the pandemic. Our election administrators need resources. They are on the front lines of how to make sure that our elections go off smoothly and safely and that people can participate, and they need federal funds. And then finally, you can make sure that you and all of your eligible friends and family vote. Thank you so much for coming and for supporting the work of the Brennan Center for Justice.